So here's just some stats, just to give you a context. There are no co-ops in the world. Right, so co-ops go back a long time. The earliest sort of recorded instance of a co-op is somewhere around the middle of the 17th century, 1760. And there's some debate about this, whether it was in the UK or there's a small town in Greece called Emilia, which claims to be the first co-op. You know, Greeks like doing that. I'm Greek, so I can say that. But the best known co-op and sort of the time marker from where the movement sort of takes its beginnings is the incorporation of the Rochdale store in Rochdale, near Manchester in the UK in 1844. Well, things have changed since then. There are now about 800 million members of co-ops globally. The top 300 co-ops employ about 20% more people than all the top multinationals put together in the world. That's just the top 300 co-ops. So the economic outcome and generation of employment and so on by co-ops internationally is huge. So in the United States, there's about 30,000 co-ops employing about 2 million people. The 100 largest agricultural co-ops reported in the 2010 stats, are making record sales, something in the order of $118, $120 billion, just from the agricultural co-ops in the United States. And then just some figures around where the concentration and participation in co-ops sort of falls internationally. The largest memberships are in India, obviously, and in China, right? And the highest proportions of sort of ratio of people participating in co-ops among some of the major countries, Canada 1 in 3, Norway 1 in 3, the United States 1 in 4, and even higher than this, as you'll see in a few minutes, is in Italy, where I've spent a lot of time researching the operation of the cooperative system, the cooperative economy in Emilia Romagna in Italy. This clicker is going to add about 20 minutes to my presentation. And then the survival rate of co-ops. You often hear about, well, co-ops, do they really work? Compared to conventional capitalist firms. They really don't work that well. They're kind of an anachronism, right? They're okay for people that, like granola and wear, funny shoes and stuff, right? Which is nonsense, of course. Co-ops generally outlast conventional capitalist firms by a ratio of almost 2 to 1 in terms of, life expectancy. These are some statistics from recent figures in Canada. In the first year, co-ops succeed at about 94%. The first year, businesses succeed for about 75%. And then it drops after that. After 5 years, 65.8% of co-ops are still in business. 39% of businesses are still in operation. And then finally, after a 10-year period, that gap increases even more. Almost 50% of co-ops after 10 years are still in operation. And that figure for conventional businesses drops down to under 20%. Right? So the success rate of co-ops is very good. So that's kind of what's been going on with co-ops in the last 150 years. They've expanded globally. They've become major economic forces, even if they're not visible, hidden in the structures of national and regional economies. Co-ops are playing a really important role. And they began in a context, of course, where the Industrial Revolution was just kicking off. Late 1700s, early 1800s in the UK, co-ops became one of the major social responses to the destruction of traditional forms of work, traditional forms of life, up until that point. in the UK. You know, child labor, the introduction of the factory system, the uprooting of people and communities from sort of local, home-based craftsmanship, rural economies, agricultural economies, craft economies. All of this was being turned over as the factory system and the concentration of capital and the centralization of production in the textile industry, in agriculture, in manufacturing, all started to take its toll on people's livelihoods, on employment. Huge unemployment was generated through the Industrial Revolution. And, of course, the collectivization of labor in the factory system, which basically sparked this huge migration away from the countryside towards the cities. So urbanization, the rise of the big cities, was one of the products of the Industrial Revolution. Child labor was a huge issue. Children as young as the age of 5 and 6 and so on were working in these huge mills. Is there somebody up on top there that might be able to advance this for me if I need it? Can you do that for me, Urban? Thank you. The social consequences and the social damage that was unleashed by the Industrial Revolution was, up until that time, probably unprecedented in its scale. Except for natural things like, you know, mass famines and epidemics and so on, the consequences of this shift in economic paradigm through the Industrial Revolution was profound. And at this time, just give you some sense of this. These are the social conditions in Britain, 19th century Britain at the time this revolution was underway, the Industrial Revolution. Mortality rates in this period, just preceding sort of the rise of Rochdale and so on. 1 in 4 children died before the first year. And then by the 5th year, more than half of children died. And then causes of death, tuberculosis, consumption. Now, some of these, I don't know what they mean. What is the decay of nature, for example? Convulsions, sort of accidents and so on, all the other infectious diseases, all of this which is exacerbated, right, by the conditions of living in congested urban environments. And this here gives you a sense of, the difference in life expectancy between the various classes, you know, in England at the time. The gentry, you know, the landed aristocracy on the left, and then laborers on the right. And in Manchester, where Rochdale and the co-op movement had a very strong presence, a very highly industrialized area, the age of life expectancy for gentry was about 38, and for a laborer was about 17 years of age. Okay? So those are the kinds of living conditions that were operating at the time that the co-op movement was rising. Can we get an advance on this? Keep going, the whole thing. All right? So I'm going to go back one. Okay, here. So the rural enclosures, the end of the commons, the end of these kind of reciprocal, collective forms of work and production, industrialization, the growth of technology, huge levels of investment, an explosion in trade internationally. And of course, what ended up happening, according to one of the great writers on this whole subject, the Great Transformation, Carl Polanyi, is that the self-regulating market, the free market system, was born. And it became the dominant paradigm that was to last to our own time and for the foreseeable future, right? So the notion of self-governing, autonomous markets being the ways in which economies were conceived and all the policies and the legislation that were enacted around economic policy, first in the UK and then spreading right around the world today, was that markets were self-regulating, autonomous systems that really had no direct connection to the communities and the societies that they were operating in. They were conceived almost like solar systems, right? They had their own logic, their own way of operating, almost in a sphere above and beyond the societies that they came from and that they impacted. That is at the heart of what I believe is driving the crisis that we're actually grappling with today. And that is what I call actually the grand delusion. The grand delusion being that economic systems are divorced from and separated from the social foundations that they in fact depend on and feed back into. So the problem becomes, how do we repair this disconnection? How do we reconnect social values and the actual living social fabric of communities and people living and working together to economic systems that reflect these everyday social values that people live by and aspire to? That's the crux of the problem. Okay? So the components of the grand delusion are this notion of homo economicus, economic man, that what drives human behavior is self-interested, right? Profit-making. And that is kind of the norm against which we measure, is one successful or not? Is one leading, a good life or not? And so on. It totally disregards the fact that there are other elements and dimensions to human nature. That people actually like doing things that give them great pleasure and satisfaction. That have really nothing to do with maximizing what economists call their utility, maximizing their capacity to consume, right? And to amplify, their ownership over stuff. People actually do like making friends for other reasons, right? People actually do like cooking and sitting down and eating together. That makes them happy. People raise children, not just because they want them for labor. These are all fundamental human traits, that have nothing to do with a self-interested, maximization of consumption, which really describes economic man. The free market myth is based on this, right? That free markets are composed really of a collection of individuals that are maximizing their self-interest through their commercial exchanges. And it's a fiction. It's always been a fiction. And it was contested at the time. It's not as if somebody came out and said, hey, free markets operate like this, they're autonomous, self-governing systems, the government should have nothing to do with them. And everybody said, oh, that sounds right. No, it was a hotly contested, battled idea, and it still is. But the voices that are challenging that idea are getting fainter and fainter and fainter. But at the time it came out, at the time it was being proposed as the ideology for the growth of this free market society in the Industrial Revolution, it was a battle line that was drawn. and cooperatives were one of the major responses that contested that idea. Not just co-ops. It was part of a broad political and social movement that included the rise of socialism, the rise of the Chartist movement, which was basically an effort to try and get a universal vote for everybody, not just people that had property. The rise of the women's movement, suffragettes and so on, later. And, of course, the cooperative movement. So the question became, how do you actually generate a humane economy? What does that actually look like? If not this free market model, what's the model that we aspire to? What does it consist of? How do you define it? So here's a stab at that. A humane economy, for me, entails a couple of key things. One, it's an economy that serves the collective interests of a society, right? But also allows for the self-fulfillment of the individual. And too often we have this kind of polarity between economic models that eulogize the collective at the expense of the individual, and that's sort of the paradigm of the state-controlled communist systems. Or you have the other extreme, where it's really the individual that is the dominant actor and the object of concern for economic systems. And that's what you have in the United States, to the cost of the collective, to the cost of community and society. What you need is a model that actually does both. And then secondly, that reciprocity is a fundamental economic principle, and that is alongside redistribution, right, which is the primary focus and function of the state, and what is called the exchange of equivalents, which is capitalism. And the exchange of equivalents simply means that we enter into an agreement to buy and sell something on an agreed upon value. I give you something, we negotiate a price for that, you give me money for it. That's the exchange of equivalents. But it's essentially a commercial transaction, right? But reciprocity, the idea that two people exchange something, gifts, favors, whatever it is, on the understanding that if I give you something today, you will reciprocate at some point, either to me or to somebody else later. Reciprocity is the absolute foundational economic principle for cooperatives, for nonprofits, for charities. The whole of that component of our society called the social economy is based on this principle of reciprocity. People exchanging favors on the expectation that they will be reciprocated. And it is a principle that is almost universally ignored if you go to school and study economics, right? Just like co-ops. This here is a purple triangle. And what I've tried to do, in a sense, is put together and as a kind of a graphic, these three principles. And to simply express the point that all three of these are in some form or another already operative in any society. The question is, how do you get the balance right, in my mind? How do you actually construct something that doesn't promote one to the exclusion of the others? So typically in the exchange of equivalents in a capitalist economy, the primary purpose of that is efficiency, right? How to not waste resources in a particular way, okay? It doesn't take into account that if this principle is left to go unchallenged and uncontrolled, you end up wasting a lot, right? But in terms of the interactions and dynamics between agents in commercial transactions, there's a minimum of waste in this. In redistribution, the aim is equality, right? And so socialist systems have that as a predominant aim. But there's only one way you can actually enforce such a system, and that's through the use of force, right? People are inherently not equal. And so when you have a system that economically constrains people as if they are equal, you end up with a problem. What has really not yet been tried is this third principle, which is the operation of reciprocity. And how do you construct economies that actually incorporate and expand and value this principle of reciprocity? And the purpose of those kinds of systems when they operate, as in cooperatives, is solidarity. The outcome of reciprocity is the strengthening of bonds between people. And when it operates in large measure, it actually builds strong communities. So the question then is, how do you get a system that actually does all these three? Because each one of these things is important. No economic system will last for very long unless it has a measure of efficiency, unless it promotes some measure of equality, and unless there are organizations that promote and build reciprocity, also known as social capital. Okay? So, there aren't a lot of models, but there is a model that I've been researching that I think does this task better than almost any other place I know of. And it's a cooperative economy. And it is the cooperative economy of Emilia, Romagna in northern Italy. How many people know this story? Okay. So, good. Not as well as you might. Okay. But I've been studying this region for about 15 years or so. It's a population of about 4 million people, northern part of Italy. There are 20 regions in Italy. This is one of them. Economic regions, this is one of them. The key city is Bologna. And consistently over the last 20 years or so, 25 years, it has been one of the best performing economic regions in the country. The GDP per capita is about 30% above the national average in Italy. The unemployment has traditionally been at the lowest part of the unemployment sort of scale in Italy is in this region. And there are about 120 economic regions in Europe, and this region is the 10th highest performing economic region in Europe. And what distinguishes this region is its use of cooperative systems. Can you move that ahead for me? One of the things that's happened is the incredible, not just the size of the co-op economy, because it's very huge, but how individual cooperatives have thrived especially in the last 15 years. These are just some figures, just to account for the incredible growth and success of co-ops, not just as small regional organizations, but emerging as major economic agents within the whole of the Italian economic system, right? They've generated more employment, they've grown in size, they've grown in market share compared to their capitalist competitors. So the co-ops in Italy are doing very, very well. And it's an interesting question, why? Why is it there they have done so well compared to other parts of Europe? And one of the reasons is because of their incredible capacity to network, to cooperate across sectors, and to work together. Cooperative networks are one of the really distinguishing features of this economy, not just among co-ops, but also among capitalist firms. And this, to me, is the real fantastic thing about this region, that the co-op idea has been adopted by the mainstream capitalist economy. They are using cooperation to help small, independent capitalist firms survive and compete in a global marketplace. And this is really interesting, because what it does is it takes the co-op idea out of sort of the co-op ghetto, right, and move it into the mainstream economy, which is what you want. You want a model that is actually going to work, not just for collective enterprises. I mean, obviously it's going to work there. That's where the interest is. But it's also useful and productive for mainstream capitalist firms, right? And that's what this model has achieved. And I'll explain it in a minute. No, go back. I want that picture. Okay. Thank you. This is Bologna, the capital city of the region. An amazing place, an ancient city. It has, the University of Bologna is Europe's oldest university, which up until about 100 years ago was a co-op. I couldn't believe it when it first started. The students actually ran that university. They hired the professors, right, and the staff that operated and ran the university. The students were really the control members of the University of Bologna, had been doing it for centuries. So, 1 in 3 Bolognese belong to a co-op of some description. Okay, so the idea of the co-op economy in Emilia-Romagna is it can be conceived as a kind of a managed cooperation between interlocking spheres, right? The co-op sector and the social economy, which is all those nonprofits and charities and so on. The public sector, which of course is the state, government, and the private sector. And one of the real powerful advantages that the region has over other regions is that they have found a way to collaborate and to manage what in most cases are conflicting sets of interests. Employers, right? Owners of firms, sitting down with the heads of the major unions, right, in Italy, and with representatives of the regional government to figure out what are we going to do to strengthen the economic performance of our region. How do we negotiate collective agreements that are fair for workers, but don't actually put people out of business? How do we actually interact with government so that it plays a role in the economy that's useful and constructive and helps, you know, small firms compete and survive and grow and so on? So the co-op idea has actually expanded to include not only the creation of co-ops and their success, not only the use of co-op systems to help small firms survive, but how do we actually think about the region as a whole and all these distinct interests as being mutually dependent interests? So that we can avoid, because I mean this region was, you know, the hotbed of political activism in Italy was Emilia-Romagna and Bologna and Tuscany. You know, following the Second World War and into the 60s, this is where the big strikes took place. You know, massive, millions of people walking out of, you know, general strikes and so on like that, shutting the whole economy down. And they finally figured out we cannot keep doing this. We've got to come up with a way of dealing with, you know, worker interests and economic interests of owners in a way that actually moves us all forward. And they've actually been very successful at doing this. Okay? So the key thread that unites all of this stuff is a cultural and political strategy that focuses on collective solutions to the challenges of economic and social development, and the policies that are put into play and what government does is to create systems that identify and then reward and then replicate collective solutions for both social and economic issues. Is everybody with me on this? These are the elements of this. A strong socialist and communitarian culture. And the political tradition in this area is strongly socialist. This is called the Red Belt, right? Bologna is the buckle of the Red Belt in Italy. And it emerged out of these incredible class struggles in the 19th century, dealing with land reform, the industrialization of the area, and so on. But it had a strong socialist tradition, and virtually every government that was elected to power to form the provincial, the regional government of Emilia-Romagna has been associated with either the socialists or the communists since the Second World War. And they're the strangest communists you will ever meet. They're called Gucci communists, right? They like the good life. They like to dress well. They like to eat well, right? But they believe ardently in social democracy, the collective good, social justice. These are things that are very deeply ingrained in his people. The one thing that they also understand is that you cannot achieve these things by turning your back on the market. It is the thing that really distinguished the Italian communists and socialists of this region from virtually every other region in Italy and the rest of the communist and socialist movement in Europe. When you normally think of social democracy or socialists, you think about, well, the market is bad, profit is bad, we'll turn to the state to basically have a command and control economy. And they never accepted that. They understood that if they were to win political power, they had to bring on board all these thousands of small, medium-sized, family-owned firms if they were actually going to make a difference. And so they began and they understood that the market was a key part of what they had to do to build the economy in this area. You don't turn your back on it, you understand it, and you utilize it. And that's why co-ops became so important. Because co-ops are a form of socialism that actually operates in the marketplace, right? That uses the power of reciprocity and cooperation to leverage control in the marketplace. Whether you're a producer trying to sell your grain or your almonds or your fruits, or whether you're a consumer and you want to get access to organic food because you can't get it, right? Or you're a group of families that want to access home care or elder care and it's not on offer. All of that has to do with leveraging collective power to influence and have some control in the marketplace. That's what co-ops do. So there was very early on an affinity, right? A partnership that became very strong and very intimate between the socialists, political socialists in Emilia-Romagna and the cooperators, the folks that are actually organizing these cooperative firms, right? And that lasted for many, many years, up until about 10, 12 years ago. There were some huge changes that took place about 12 years ago that kind of disconnected that formal alliance. Co-ops are much more independent and autonomous now as a sector than they used to be. But they succeeded for as long as they did because they had an understanding and support of regional government to help them do that. Okay? So the government was activist. There are high levels of social capital in the region. Long history of trust and collaboration, not just among workers, but between landowners and their tenant farmers. between employers and their employees and so on. And what's been happening is that the result has been a model that actually weaves together and braids cooperation on the one hand and competition. The region has to be economically competitive, and individual firms have to be competitive if they're to survive in the global marketplace. But how do they do that and remain local, community-based firms, many of them family firms still, and remain small? And the only way they can do that, not just in Italy, but anywhere, is by working together. So what they ended up doing is building these systems that support small, independent capitalist firms. So just to give you an example, they would do an analysis of, say, all the ceramics firms operating in a particular region, because the industry in Emilia-Romagna is collected around towns that have high degrees of specialization. It's ceramics here, it's footwear there, it's food over here, right? So the foods that you sort of have become household words, like balsamic vinegar, Parmesan cheese, Parma ham, right? These are all foods that come from this region. And not surprisingly, we're kind of the epicenter of the slow food movement, right? Also began. But it's not just that. It's high-tech products, highly crafted, high-value products. The finest motorcycles in the world, the Ducati, its factory is still in Bologna. Ferraris, Lamborghinis are made in and around Modena, which is in Emilia-Romagna, right? So it's not just kind of the things we normally associate with cooperative systems, like food and products, like producers, grain and marketing, those kinds of things, but also high quality, top end products like Ferraris and Lamborghinis that are made here. There are about 8,000 co-ops. They constitute about a third of the GDP of the region. No, it's not 1 in 3, it's 3 in 4 Bolognese that belong to a co-op. And it's probably the highest density of cooperatives in Europe. I won't stay on that. That's just all right? So, and then the capitalist economy, like I was saying, is composed of about 400,000 small and medium-sized firms. There's one enterprise for every 10 people in the region. It is a veritable hothouse of entrepreneurial activity. And as I said, they are organized along sectoral and geographic lines depending on the kind of work that's going on, whether it's knitwear or footwear or whatever. And they are managed through these business associations that represent, these kinds of sectors, right? And these business associations are also very highly interacted and networked with the co-op community and the political system as well. So labor, co-ops, and businesses are also aligned along traditional political affiliations. So, for example, there are trade unions that are associated with the communists, or the historical communists, or associated with the Republicans, or associated with the right wing, right? So these federations are also very, very political, but they do operate in deep, interconnected networks that aggregate these firms within those federations. Okay. So I'm just going to end on this to describe how this kind of Emilia model actually operates using these systems. It's small firms cooperating in production networks. So if you're looking at, for example, the production of a sweater as an end product, you have a whole string of small firms that are collaborating for the production of that one sweater. So some of them will be in the design end of it, some of them will be in the dyeing, some of them will be in the cutting, some of them will be marketing, contracting with the buyers, and so on. But the point is that that sweater is a product of a very intimate collaboration among complementary firms that are responsible for some part of that production line, that production process. And that happens in all of these key areas of production, whether we're talking about footwear or ceramics or agricultural machinery, right? You have this kind of interaction among these small firms that actually allows them to remain small, to be highly specialized, to get very, very good at what they do, to adapt technology that is scaled to a small firm and allows them to be highly flexible and adaptable to changes in consumer demand and in the marketplace, and to work together so that cooperatively they produce some of the highest quality products on the planet, whether we're talking about food or whether we're talking about suits or whether we're talking about footwear. So one of the products of this is habits of cooperation. The success breeds a predisposition to continue cooperating. And over time, what this does is build not only very strong networks among these independent actors, but an incredible growth and supply of social capital and relational capital among these, in quotation marks, competing firms. So I visited these industrial districts. Just to give you one example. Lunchtime. And there is a restaurant, huge, serves, fantastic meals, typically a co-op. One of the largest worker co-ops in Europe is one of the cantinas that provides lunch and food services for the industrial districts in this area. And all the factories, all the businesses in this neighborhood have together commissioned the construction of this co-op restaurant to provide lunch services to their workers. So they all go and they have lunch in this restaurant. And over time, they build relationships. They eat together, and what's really fantastic is they share knowledge. They share information, right? How's it going where you're working? Oh, we got the same problem. How are you dealing with it? Oh, here's how we did it. Oh, okay. And they share that stuff. And it's incredible. They really advocate and promote the sharing of technical information, right? Of solutions, innovations that are spread, not just as a matter of public policy, which they are, but more interestingly and more powerfully through the deep interpersonal relationships and the relational capital that they establish over time. Right? It's incredibly powerful. And so this deep, deep well of social capital that has been building up is not just among, sort of non-commercial relationships among people living together in community, but also within the industrial system. Most of these contracts, when I was describing earlier how a group of firms will come together and produce a sweater, right, or an Armani suit, almost all of these transactions take place on a handshake. They spend virtually no money on legal agreements between each other. The transaction costs for operating the system are actually far, far lower than anything that would happen here. Because anytime, if I'm going to do business with you, what I want is a legal, I want lawyers to look at it, right? And why is that? Because there's no trust. Exactly. The absence of trust is directly proportional to the number of lawyers in a society. It's true. The higher the per capita ratio of lawyers in a society, the lower the trust. Social capital is based on trust, and it generates trust. And so the transaction costs, because the social capital is so deep here, are incredibly low, and lawyers are relatively few in number. Where am I at here? Okay. And then the policies that are actually promoted by the regional government intend that people work together. So there are programs that are available to do research and development. The regional government handles the investment programs that they receive from the European Union to invest in, industrial development. And what they do is they offer these programs and the money only to groups that are actually going to use it in some kind of a shared fashion. And it doesn't have to be a cooperative. But what it means is they have to come up with collective solutions, right, for the use of that money. So it's not only the interpersonal, informal relationships that support cooperation, it's the formal policies that the government uses to promote economic development that also supports cooperatives and cooperative relationships. And then, of course, there's this huge interaction across sectors. The labor relations that I told you about and so on. Let's move on to the next slide. So this is just one example of how the co-op idea has actually been utilized to create a cooperative economy where it's not just 8,000 co-ops that are producing, and utilizing the co-op idea, but all of these thousands and thousands of small firms that are doing as well as they're doing because they're actually working together with the support of regional governments. So I'm going to close on addressing these questions. Can we just go back one, please? So what is the role then of co-ops in the age of capital? What's the essential nature of our current crisis? And then, of course, what's the nature of our response? And what I'm trying to do here is bridge, what are normally conceived of as quite different spheres. The co-op sphere, the private sector, capitalist economy, kind of communitarian, social democratic ideas, right? How do you actually link these together for a model that actually works in the circumstance we find ourselves in? We are in a capitalist system. It depends on the success of small and medium firms to create jobs. That's the backbone of regional, and national economies. But we need ways in which they can actually operate and utilize co-op ideas that make sense to them within the context that we're actually working in. Not some utopian future, cooperative economy where everybody and everything is a co-op. That's not going to happen. We have to find ways of utilizing these ideas in the real world, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Okay. Can I have the next slide? One of the overriding facts of our contemporary reality is globalization. And what's interesting to me is that the globalization of capital today replicates the very same conditions that gave rise to the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s in the UK. The concentration of power in the hands of capital, the disruption and exploitation of labor, the expansion of capital control over land, right? These are all characteristics of how globalization is working in the world, in the developing nations of the world. Those are exactly the same conditions that were an outcome of the free market model and, as Bologna called, the Great Transformation in the UK in the 1800s. And what's happening in these places is exactly the same response. People are asking, how are we going to defend ourselves against the destructive and corrosive impacts of international and global capital on our communities? How do we protect small farms? How do we retain control of our local politics? How do we maintain the integrity of our environment, right, against this onslaught that comes along with globalization? Small-scale, village-based work. So all of this stuff is a replay of the film that started in the 1800s in the UK. So co-ops are one response to that. An example, one of the most successful examples of a global cooperative response to a global problem is the fair trade movement. Fair trade is based on small farmer co-ops that, aggregate local small farmers and link producers to consumers in the first world. And the focus is, what is the impact of your buying this cup of coffee on the farmers in Bolivia, in Mexico, and so on? It's an ethical focus. But it is made possible. It's possible for me as an individual consumer to do something about that, because there's a cooperative system in place that actually ensures that a fair price that I'm prepared to pay for that coffee is actually going to make it to that small producer and that farmer in their community in Brazil. And the co-op idea is at the very foundation of the fair trade movement. Well, that is a typical response writ large, internationally, to the problem of the concentration of capital and the influence of monopolies on trade relationships internationally. And so when people ask, well, what can a co-op do as a response to globalization, I always point to the fair trade movement. That is just one example. Can we move on to the next slide? Right. So co-ops in the context of globalization are a major key to recovering control over local economies. And during the 1960s and 70s, often co-ops were used as a way to promote economic development by states, governments in the developing world, in Africa and Asia and so on. Typically, these ended in a disaster. Co-ops and co-op systems, to survive and to do well, have to be independent, autonomous systems. Democratic control in co-ops means that it's actually the members that use the co-op that control the co-op. And as soon as that is turned on its head, and it's governments that start utilizing them, always for the right reasons, right? They end up failing. They end up failing because they become dependent on governments, and that culture of mutuality and reciprocity that is built up when people actually have to work together and make decisions together and figure out what the answers and the solutions to their economic problems are together. All that is hollowed out when the power comes out of the co-op and placed in the hands of some, well-meaning, often, civil servant in government somewhere. I just came back a couple of months ago from a trip to Cuba because the Cuban government realizes it has a problem. That the command and control economy that they've been operating since the revolution is simply not sustainable. When the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of the 1980s, 1990, 85% of the trade that Cuba had disappeared overnight. And they entered into this long, dark crisis, which is still going on. So what they're looking for is a model that's actually going to sustain and support their revolutionary ideals, but isn't a capitalist model. So they've been thinking about cooperatives. So I went down as part of a delegation to sort of see kind of what was going on and see how we could respond to this. There's about a dozen of us came down from Canada mostly. And all their intentions are good. I personally believe in their ideals. But I had deep, deep reservations around control. How is it that a government that is actually committed and addicted to state command and control systems, that's kind of, the mindset, going to actually develop co-ops that are free and autonomous, operating in markets that actually they control? And that's the crux of the problem. I don't know if they can do it. But I do know, unless they do it, the co-op model, the co-op sort of evolution that they're hoping is going to save socialism in Cuba, it's not going to work. And the same is true not just in Cuba, but everywhere else as well. Okay. Let's move on. So, I'm going to end on this point. The questions of sustainable economies, the questions of slowing down the pace of life, of reclaiming control over our local economies, over the products that we actually consume, cannot be addressed unless we understand how to react to the question of globalization. Obviously, the global warming issues, the environmental degradation issues, the concentration of capital issues, the issue of inequality, income inequality, class inequality, in not just the United States, but internationally. All of these things transpire as a consequence of globalization. The restructuring has to take place along the basis of democratic control. Not just of our economies, I mean, that's kind of but democratic control of the institutions that actually frame, right, the ways in which our economies work. One of the things that came out of the Occupy movement, right, was the bank transfer day. So co-ops are seen as, a response and a solution by this whole new wave that's coming out saying, how do we respond? How do we change the paradigm? In the 3 months from, I think it was October to November last year, when the bank transfer sort of movement was on, over 1 million Americans transferred their bank accounts from banks to credit unions. Over 1 million in a 3-month period. That represented like an unprecedented increase in the number of members that credit unions got. Something like 3 times the number of members that had joined up to credit unions from the year before. So it's clearly in the air. And people are beginning to understand that unless we actually democratize our economies, the questions of inequality and so on are not going to be addressed. So co-ops are, in a sense, the antibodies of globalization. They are. Okay? So let's go on to the next slide. This is the point. People are looking for alternatives. And when we walk out into the Occupy movement demonstrations and we ask someone, okay, here you are demonstrating. If not this, then what? What is the answer? Usually there is no clear answer. Usually there's a lot of passion and there's an explanation of values, right? I care about social justice. I care about protecting our environment. I care about people not being, poor or working hard all their lives and have no money to retire on. And those are all good things to care about. But what's your solution? Okay? So, this is where we're at. Right? This is a shot I took in New York a little while back. Can I have the next slide? This has now entered our vocabulary. The 1% versus the 99% is probably the most significant triumph of this whole thing. Is placing the class issue and the inequality issue on the front pages of our newspapers, so that it's actually an issue that people are confronting for the first time in decades. Right? Co-ops have a lot to say about this. But co-ops have not been saying a lot about this. Right? I know this personally. I mean, I'm in the movement day in, day out. And my biggest concern is, why are they missing in action? Why is it that this movement has arisen, right, globally, and co-ops are really not front and center in it? That's the challenge for co-ops. The challenge, I think, for all of us is to understand what's the relevance of cooperation and reciprocity in fixing what's broken. Understanding that, being aware of that. The challenge for co-ops is, how do we regain our political identity? How do we recapture the momentum and sense of mission that were at the foundation of the co-op movement in the 1800s? When it was not just an economic model, it was a political mission. How does the co-op movement actually regain that momentum and recapture its identity as a movement and not just as an economic model? The worst thing you can say about co-ops is that they're an alternative enterprise model. I mean, what does that actually amount to unless it's actually hitched to a political intention to actually transform this model and make it an economic and political force so that it has a social mission? That's the challenge of the co-op movement and cooperators. And whether they play that role, whether it happens or not, may in fact be up to people outside of the co-op movement to say, like, where are you guys at? To take a pointy stick and, stick it into some of them and say, this is what we expect of you. And if you don't want to do this, let us know, Because expectations are that these should be organizations that have a leadership role in the kind of change people are looking for. Right? So that's a task. I encourage all of you to take pointed sticks, seek out cooperators and prod them with them and say, come on, get off your ass and do something with us. All right? I'm going to leave it at that. And okay. Yes. Yes. How are you? I thought you looked familiar. Right. 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 Yeah. Right. That's a tricky question. I have to trust you to ask that question, right? That's a tricky question. What's interesting is that a number of the Emilia-Romagna co-ops have been very, very successful, actually, at operating internationally. They are co-ops, for example, SACME and CMT, huge organizations that.
Can I switch in? We can bring this one to the audience. People are watching this live online, and we'd love to be able to hear your questions. I'm sure they'd love to hear what you guys are saying out in the crowd, too, so this will be an audience mic.
Right. It's on? Yeah, okay. So they've been actually very successful in operating globally. An organization like SACME, which is a worker co-op in Imola. They produce machinery largely from the ceramics industry. Have operations in close to 20 countries internationally. And so they are one of kind of the stars of the co-op movement in Italy. The only guarantee that that co-op is going to continue acting like a co-op, promoting social justice, promoting fairness, promoting those kinds of values, the only guarantee is the quality of the people that work in that co-op. In other words, how committed are they to those values? And the degree that they are committed to those values often is a reflection of the degree to which the co-op actually provides education and support for those values. Cooperatives that don't replicate and strengthen the culture of cooperation in those organizations will not do that. Over time, this is one of the things that's happened in a lot of successful co-ops. They have let go of their culture, right? They have been, many of them, co-opted by the mainstream culture. So, for example, instead of training managers and leaders within the co-op system to become the executive directors and the managers and the CEOs of the co-ops, they hire people from outside. Credit unions are notoriously bad for this. So are a lot of other co-ops. And I think that's been a consequence of an onslaught of free enterprise ideology over the last 40 years, 30 years. Everybody's been affected by it, including the co-ops. And unless you have a system that actually is consciously cultivating co-op culture in universities, right? Training people to understand and think about cooperation as an economic model so that they actually are available to go and work in co-ops when they need managers, right? Unless you have a co-op education program within co-ops that reminds people, what their mission is. If co-ops are half as good at identifying, clarifying, and promoting their business mission as capitalist firms are for theirs, co-ops will be doing fantastically better, right? So that's the long answer to your question. It's not going to be possible for organizations like SACME and others to actually live their co-op values locally and internationally unless they actually have a strong co-op culture that allows them and promotes them and predisposes them to do that. Urban.
Well, first, I just want to thank you, John, for taking the time to be with us and for that presentation. I thought it was great. Thanks, everyone, for being here with us. You know, your presence at this conference was itself a cross-sector effort. You know, food co-ops, farmer co-ops, worker co-ops all collaborated to bring you here to enter into a dialogue with this SLO movement. Because I think we can all agree, when we look at the aspirations of SLO, I think we can see a lot of commonalities with the cooperative movement, both historically and now. The challenge that I see, and let's leave logistics aside for a second. Maybe there's some logistical challenge, but this room, in my opinion, should be packed. It's not. And I guess the question I have for you is what do you see as the key obstacles for this dialogue that we're trying to have with, you know, other folks who are looking at the mainstream economy around them and seeing problems? We see those problems. We think we have some answers. When we're trying to engage in that dialogue, what's the obstacle, and what do you think we could do better, as you said, to get off our asses? Because I felt like this is a pretty big effort to get off our asses and engage in a dialogue. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. Well, it's this is a problem that is especially acute, you know, in, you know, Canada, the United States, you know, some of the European countries, where, as I said just now, you know, the co-op movement has sort of lost its political intention, right? And it's also a consequence of the fact that the movement is so heterogeneous, you know? It's not as if they all have one common mission. I mean, you have, you know, very different types of people doing very different types of things all over the place. And it's one of the strengths of the movement. That's why it's lasted as long as it has, is its incredible diversity, right? You got food co-ops, you got health co-ops, you got, you know, worker co-ops, you got, you know, all kinds of co-ops. This, you know, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of different models, right? And so that is both a source of strength and durability, right? And also a major challenge in getting everybody to start to think about collectively what's our role here. Because there isn't a collective vision about that, except among some people, you know, I count myself among them, that feel that the model itself, to continue to be relevant, has to have a political mission, right? And what that means is having groups of co-ops that are aligned around that kind of a mission to actually develop a game plan. To say, in our region, right, here are the things that are coming up over the next, you know, 5 years. Here are the opportunities for us to get our message out and to be visible. Who's going to do it? Who's signing up? Who's going to this meeting? Who's going to that conference? Where is the PowerPoint presentation that you guys are going to be providing? Who are the people that you're going to be meeting with? And what do we want to get at the end of this 5-year term? For that, you need an organization that can actually do that. And you're building one, right? In BC, the BC Co-op Association is kind of involved in that kind of work. We're not doing as well as we could, in part because we're a small organization. I have a staff of 5 people, right? So we run a youth program, we do co-op development, we do education work, I come to conferences like this, and I also run an organization, right? But that's what it means. It means you need to identify the co-ops and the leaders within those co-ops that are prepared to get the message out. And maybe there's 1 of them, maybe there's 3 of them, maybe there's 20. But you have to find them. And you have to give them the tools to get that message out.
I have a number of different questions, but one of them is about decision making. Thinking of, other than the smaller co-ops that may work collectively, a lot of these run by majority rule, Robert's rules. Is that, and how is that helping or not helping? I tend to think of majority rule democracy as not all that helpful in many ways. So I'm just curious about how in Emilia Romagna or other places, how that's been working.
Yeah. You know, and again, it's so much a reflection of what are the systems and the skills that have been built up in a particular organization, right? You have some organizations that have developed the mechanisms to make economic democracy work at even large levels, large scales. In others, where even you got a dozen people, working in the co-op, and they can't agree where to go to lunch, right? And it's a question of, what are the kinds of conscious skills around democratic governance that are being taught and learned and utilized in a particular co-op. And it varies from co-op to co-op. I guess the main point is that it's possible. I mean, I've seen too many large co-ops that are actually being very successful as enterprises, as businesses, but also very successful as social organizations with a co-op culture because they're paying attention to this. Because it's something that the membership actually expects, and the membership is actually attuned to doing what's necessary to make that work. I mentioned earlier this organization called SACME, which is a global, a multinational cooperative. Their membership in Emilia, in Imola, where the town is, where it's actually founded and located, they have about 400 and some odd members. Okay, every year, though, those members are there for the budget discussions and decisions. The review of a budget and the passage of a financial plan for the following year takes about 3 days. And they're all there for that 3 days. And so what happens in that is everybody becomes extraordinarily familiar with the economics of the organization. They can't do that without having that kind of knowledge. The board of directors that is actually responsible for facilitating and managing this whole process, they prepare for this months and months in advance on the understanding that they're not just dealing with a rubber stamp membership. They're dealing with members that are actually going to debate and take an active role in the decision making. So they themselves have to prepare for that, right? So the training of participation in decision making in accordance with democratic governance is going on both consciously and over a long period of time, and it's part of the selection process for becoming a member. If I want to become a member in SACME, I have to have had a period of time where I've been working in the organization. I think it's 3 years or something. I have to be nominated by a fellow cooperator. I have to be approved by a committee of other cooperators. And what they look for, they've got a whole long list of things that they look for before they will accept me as a member. One of the things they look for is, am I a cooperator? Am I actually able and interested in working with others, contributing, as an active member of the organization in the governance of the organization? And that is something that predisposes me to actually doing the kind of decision making that you're talking about. It's it's not considered a right, it's a privilege that you're selected by your peers to become a member. So it's a very interesting culture, but what it produces is a very, very high-performing organization with leaders that are trained to do the kind of work that a cooperative organization needs done if it's going to function, especially at the scale that an organization like SACME operates at. Yes?
Hi, thank you for your talk. You mentioned early on about senior care.
Right.
And there's a lot of sectors of our economy that might not really even belong in our economy, but that's where they are.
Right.
Senior care, I think, is a part of that. And with the generation of baby boomers retiring, this is a demographic thing that's going to be more and more impactful.
Right.
I'm interested in ways of using cooperative models to create things like senior co-housing,
Right.
where people can live together in a cooperative way and aren't
Right.
at the vagaries of whoever. Also, as a young farmer, finding cooperative ways to create eco-villages and
Right.
shared communities, various forms. And it seems that there's financing mechanisms possible when you aggregate,
Right.
and that the care, the relationships are there. But there's a lot of obstacles. And I'm wondering if you would address the obstacles, but also the vision of what's possible within these sectors.
Right. Senior care is something I've been researching for a while. It's one of those areas of real opportunity for co-ops. And it's part of, I think, what cooperatives are set up to play a role in, which is the provision of relational goods, is what they're called. The provision of the kinds of services that neither the government or the for-profit commercial economy, the private sector, are particularly good at providing. Right? Senior care is one good example, the long-term care, right? There are a whole lot of models that are being used for the provision of elder care. Co-housing is one of them. I've come across some really interesting models of foster, sort of kind of like foster care models, where the actual members of the co-op are individual homeowners who have a suite or a room that they actually want to use for the provision of housing for seniors. And so in that model, what the co-op does is make sure that the membership, which is the homeowners, actually comply with a set of quality standards, right, for the provision of accommodation. Actually provides a system whereby they can match up seniors that are looking for shelter or accommodation with members of the co-op who have a place to offer. They provide support services like transportation, access to home care, sometimes support to homeowners around, how do you actually deal with this particular type of senior, training. So that's one interesting model that doesn't really require an awful lot of capital, right? What it requires is an organization that's capable of mediating and matching the offer of shelter on the part of homeowners and the demand for that on the part of seniors that may not have the capital to actually purchase a place, or they need some other model, right, that is less expensive for them. And then there's other models where the creation of, for example, a nursing home. In Canada, there's been a whole wave of organizations that have been previously funded by government, right, that are being losing their funding or have a reduction in funding, or the government's closing down a nursing facility, a long-term care facility. And what we've been advocating is organize a co-op, which would be a partnership between the caregivers and the families that actually have people that require that service, and that's called the multi-stakeholder co-op. And there are examples of those kinds of elder care co-ops, but what we're running into is resistance in many cases from labor, from unions who feel that this is a step towards privatization, right? So what we have to overcome is this notion that caregivers and families actually controlling, the provision of nursing care services to elders is just another step in the road to privatization. And so that's an education challenge that has to do with sitting down with labor leaders and nurses unions and saying, look, there's another way of thinking about social care that isn't just an alternative between state-funded and state-delivered systems and privatization on the other. I didn't even get into this in my presentation, but social co-ops that provide social care, many of them for seniors, are a big part of the co-op movement in Italy. There are something like 7,000 or 8,000 social co-ops providing social care services to people, and a lot of them are seniors. And they utilize a whole range of models, everything from those kind of foster models I'm talking about, to co-housing, to the organization delivery of long-term care services and home care services. So what I want to suggest is you go to our website. It's bcca.coop. And on our website, you'll find a document called Co-op Elder Care in Canada. Right? I wrote that. But it's also a survey of co-op models for elder care in the United States as well.
Okay, I think we should make this the last question.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. It's been wonderful so far. My question focuses on the education system and what's going wrong. I went to a school that had a really well-known business program, and I don't think the word co-op was ever mentioned. I'm just wondering how us as cooperators can try to get into there in the best way, and your thoughts on what's going wrong and the best ways to tackle it.
Boy. Yeah, I mean, it's there used to be actually more mention of co-ops, before. And over time, slowly, any reference to cooperative models have been expunged from the curricula of the business schools, not just of the United States, but of Canada as well. And I think that has not been an accident. I think it's been a deliberate process of purging any alternative understanding of how economies work and how enterprises should be structured. And it's part of the grip and expansion of free market ideology in our system, in our culture. So to go now into those systems again and say, hey, what happened to co-ops? We think you should be paying more attention to them, is not going to be easy, because the faculty and the heads of those economics departments and those business schools and so on are committed, by and large, many of them, the ones that have real power, are committed to a free market model. And so it's no accident that you don't hear about co-ops in those business schools. Okay, so that entails a particular kind of resistance. It's not just, I think, ignorance. I have a feeling it's actually ideological, right? So that's one challenge. What co-ops and co-op federations like ours have been doing, however, is introducing students in high schools to co-ops through programs that go directly to them through the high schools. So, for example, what we do is we have a winter program where our director for youth programs goes out with other young people and does a series of workshops introducing young people to co-ops, but not just co-ops, but around cooperation, leadership skills, team building skills, and linking those into the kinds of issues we're talking about here. Questions of sustainability, questions of economic and social justice, and so on, right? And they get an enormous response back. There's a huge thirst and hunger for this kind of vision, among young people. And when they are exposed to it, the response is powerful. And so how we're approaching it is that way. The other way of doing it is actually to identify a university or a department in a university with a champion that is prepared to actually develop, a stream or a program that actually is focused on not just co-ops. I don't think that's enough, but co-ops and social economy, some of the broader issues that we've been raising here. And we've been successful in that. We've got an MA program in community development at the University of Victoria. There's a number of other programs on management of cooperative enterprises at St. Mary's University, for example, in Nova Scotia. But that has been a product of co-op leaders and co-op money. Some key co-ops saying, yeah, we're prepared to put some money into this to help get this off the ground. And then going out and doing the work and finding the champions and then going through that very convoluted bureaucratic process to actually get a program. But it's possible. All right. Thank you very much.